The storm had been creeping in all afternoon, heavy clouds rolling over the small coastal town like an ominous warning. By nightfall, the wind had become relentless, howling through the empty streets, rattling old storefront signs, and sending waves crashing violently against the rocky shore. Rain slammed against rooftops in thick sheets, washing out the roads and turning the air thick with humidity. The town's emergency broadcast repeated the same message every few minutes, a severe storm warning, urging residents to stay indoors and off the roads. But for Walter Dawson, staying inside wasn't an option. Walt had lived through plenty of storms in his 67 years, but this one felt different. It wasn't just the weather, though the gale-force winds were enough to send even the most stubborn residents scrambling for cover. It was something else, a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was coming, something worse than the storm. Walt pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he stepped onto the slick pavement outside the Shoreline Animal Rescue Center. The shelter sat on the edge of town, nestled between the docks and an old industrial lot, a place most people didn't bother to notice. But for Walt, it had become a refuge, a place to pass the time, to keep his hands busy, and most of all, to keep from sitting alone in that quiet house, haunted by the memories of a life that no longer existed. He had once been a hero in this town, a firefighter, a man people called in their worst moments, when flames consumed homes, when lives hung in the balance. He had run into burning buildings, carried people to safety, fought back disaster with his own two hands. But that was before his body slowed, before the fire station became a place filled with younger men who didn't need him anymore, before cancer took the only person who ever made coming home feel like something worth looking forward to. Now, he spent his evenings here, in a dimly lit shelter filled with the forgotten, dogs that had been abandoned, mistreated, or deemed too much trouble for anyone to bother saving. In some ways, he figured, they weren't so different from him. And then there was Rex. The first time Walt had seen the Malinois, the dog had been pacing the length of his kennel like a caged lion, muscles tight, eyes sharp, ears flicking at every sound. There was something in those eyes, something Walt recognized. The look of a soldier without a war, a machine built for a purpose that no longer existed. Rex had been a K9 search and rescue dog, trained to find survivors in collapsed buildings and disaster zones. He had spent years working alongside elite teams, sniffing through rubble, saving lives. But after an injury left him unable to perform at full capacity, he had been discarded, just another tool past its prime. The shelter staff had labeled him as unadoptable, too aggressive, too unpredictable, a liability. Walt didn't buy it. He had seen how Rex watched him, how the dog calculated every movement in the room. This wasn't aggression. This was a mind still running at full speed, searching for direction, waiting for a command that would never come. And just like that, Walt had found himself drawn to the dog, spending more time with him than any of the others. The shelter staff warned him that Rex was too dangerous, that his history made him unsuitable for adoption. But Walt had never been one to believe in lost causes. Thunder cracked overhead as he stepped into the shelter, shaking rain from his coat. The power had already flickered twice that evening, and the building hummed under the strain of the storm outside. Most of the dogs were curled up in their kennels, sensing the unease in the air. But Rex stood alert, ears pricked forward, watching Walt the moment he entered, his tail stiff, his muscles tense. "You feel it too, don't you?" Walt muttered, rubbing a hand over his face as he moved toward the back office. "Something's coming." Rex didn't make a sound. He just stared at him, waiting. Across town, Lena Harper gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The windshield wipers fought against the relentless downpour, barely clearing enough visibility for her to see the road ahead. The wind rocked the car violently, and she could feel the tires slip against the flooded pavement. She shouldn't have been out here. She knew that. but she hadn't had a choice. Oliver whimpered in the back seat, and Lena's heart clenched. Her 6-month-old son was sick, burning with fever, and she had been trying to make it to the next town, to a safe house where she could finally stop running. But the storm had cut off her path, forcing her to turn onto a back road that led nowhere. And now she was stranded. A flash of headlights in her rearview mirror sent a jolt of panic through her chest. Not just any headlights. She knew that car, Mark Sutton. Her breath caught. He had found her. Tires screeched behind her as the SUV accelerated, closing the distance too fast. Panic clawed at her throat. She jerked the wheel, veering onto a narrow dirt path just as the impact hit, metal slamming against metal, sending her car spinning. The world tilted. Rain. Wind. A sickening crunch as the vehicle skidded into a ditch. Lena gasped for air, her heart hammering in her chest as she turned in desperation to the back seat. Oliver was still there, still crying, alive. She fumbled with the seatbelt, hands shaking, every muscle screaming at her to move. But then she saw it, through the rain-streaked window, a shadow moving toward the car. Mark. He was coming for them. Lena's pulse thundered in her ears. She had one chance. She reached for the door, wrenched it open against the wind, and ran. She ran for Oliver, she ran for her life, and she ran straight into the storm. Back at the shelter, Rex let out a sudden, sharp bark. Walt turned, startled. The Malinois was pacing now, ears flattened, body taut like a coiled spring. Something had his attention, something outside. The storm raged on, rain hammering against the metal roof in a steady, relentless rhythm. Then came the sound. So faint, so easily missed among the storm's fury. But Walt heard it. A cry. Not from a dog, not from an animal. From something much smaller. And Rex was already moving. The wind howled through the deserted streets, rattling windows and bending trees under its relentless force. Rain lashed against the tin roof of the Shoreline Animal Rescue Center, a steady, unrelenting hammering that drowned out all other sounds. Walter Dawson had been through plenty of storms before, but this one felt different. He moved through the dimly lit shelter, checking the locks on the kennels as he always did before closing up. Most of the dogs were curled up in their corners, ears twitching at the occasional crash of thunder, their instincts telling them to wait out the storm. But Rex was different. The Malinois stood at full alert, his body stiff, ears pricked forward, eyes locked on the door as if expecting something to burst through it at any second. His muscles twitched with tension, his breathing controlled but sharp. Then, without warning, he lunged toward the entrance, barking with a force that seemed to shake the very walls. Walter spun around, startled. "Hey, what's gotten into you?" he muttered, stepping toward the agitated dog. But Rex wasn't just barking, he was warning. His paws scraped against the kennel floor, his deep, guttural growl sending shivers down Walter's spine. Lightning split the sky outside, illuminating the soaked pavement for a brief second before plunging everything back into darkness. That's when Walter heard it. A sound so faint, so easily swallowed by the storm that he might have dismissed it if not for the way Rex's entire body reacted. It was a cry. Not an animal's, not the distant wail of the wind. A baby. Walter felt his pulse quicken. Maybe he was imagining it, the storm playing tricks on his tired mind. But Rex wasn't hesitating. Before Walter could react, the dog reared up on his hind legs, claws scrabbling against the kennel door with such force that the old metal latch snapped. Rex was free, and the moment the door swung open, he bolted, straight out into the raging storm. "Rex!" Walter yelled after him, but the dog was already gone, a dark blur disappearing into the sheets of rain. Walter swore under his breath. His first instinct was to let the dog go. He wasn't some reckless young firefighter anymore, running headfirst into danger. His days of heroism were long behind him. But then came that sound again, a desperate, choked sob, barely there beneath the howling wind. Walter's gut twisted. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. With a deep breath, he pulled his coat tighter against the cold, bracing himself against the storm, and followed Rex into the night. Walter's boots splashed through puddles, water seeping into his socks as he trudged down the desolate road. Visibility was near zero. The wind pushed against him like an invisible force, trying to send him back inside where it was safe and warm. But Rex was ahead somewhere, leading him towards something Walter wasn't sure he wanted to find. A crash of thunder shook the sky, and for a brief moment, another flash of lightning lit up the world around him. That's when Walter saw it. A car, abandoned on the side of the road. Its headlights were off, its engine silent. The passenger door hung open, swaying slightly with the wind. And right beside it, Rex. The dog stood motionless, his head lowered, his entire body taut with focus. He wasn't barking anymore. He was waiting. Walter's heart pounded as he approached, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The moment he reached the car, everything inside him went still. There, nestled in the back seat, barely visible beneath a thin, soaked blanket, was a baby. Walter felt his chest tighten. He blinked, willing the sight before him to be some trick of the shadows. But it wasn't. A real, living, breathing infant, no older than a few months, lay there shivering violently. "Oh, hell," Walter muttered under his breath. His hands moved on instinct, scooping up the fragile bundle with a gentleness he hadn't used in years. The baby let out a weak, pitiful whimper, its tiny fingers clenching in reflex against the cold. Walter wrapped his coat around the child, shielding it from the rain, trying to generate as much warmth as he could. His mind raced. How the hell had a baby ended up out here in the middle of a storm, alone? And then, a sound, a different sound. Not the wind, not the rain. Something else. Walter froze. Rex's ears flicked toward the darkness, his head snapping up. His body tensed, his growl low and menacing. Walter turned sharply, squinting through the rain. Something moved in the shadows. Someone. A figure, just beyond the reach of the flickering streetlight, standing still. Watching. The hairs on Walter's arms stood on end. His grip on the baby tightened. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. No answer. The figure didn't move, didn't retreat, just watched. Walter's breathing grew heavier. His instincts, dulled by years of retirement, flared back to life. He didn't know who this person was, but he knew one thing for certain. Whoever they weren't here to help. Rex took a step forward, his growl deepening, his body lowering as if ready to lunge. The message was clear. He wouldn't let them get closer. Walter didn't wait. With one last glance at the figure, he turned and ran. He ran for the shelter. He ran for safety. And most of all, he ran because something told him that whatever was watching them in the storm wasn't finished yet. The rain hadn't let up. It hammered against the windows of Walter's small house, a relentless rhythm that matched the storm still raging outside. The baby, Oliver, according to the embroidered name stitched on the tiny blue onesie he was wearing, had finally stopped crying. Wrapped tightly in blankets, he lay asleep on Walter's old couch, his tiny chest rising and falling with soft, shallow breaths. Walter sat at the worn wooden table across the room, staring at the grainy footage on his laptop screen. The town's traffic cameras weren't the best, but they did their job, capturing glimpses of people who passed through the deserted streets before the worst of the storm hit. He scrubbed through the footage, searching for anyone who could explain how a baby ended up abandoned in the middle of the night. Rex lay at his feet, his ears flicking with every gust of wind that rattled the house. Then Walter saw her. His finger froze on the keyboard. A woman stumbled into frame on the grainy black and white footage, soaked, barefoot, limping. She clutched at the brick wall of an alleyway for support before collapsing onto the ground. Walter's stomach clenched. There. That had to be the baby's mother. Without a second thought, he pushed back from the table and grabbed his coat. Rex was already on his feet, sensing the urgency in Walter's movements. Walter hesitated only for a second, his eyes darting toward Oliver's tiny sleeping form. But the baby was safe, safer than his mother, wherever she was. With one last glance, Walter stepped into the storm once more. The alley was a dark, narrow strip between an old barber shop and an abandoned laundromat. Water pooled in cracks along the pavement, and the wind funneled through the tight space, making it feel even colder than the rest of the town. Walter's flashlight cut through the darkness, its weak beam searching. And then, there, a slumped figure near the edge of the alley, completely still. Walter quickened his pace. She was young, no older than 30, her long hair plastered to her face from the rain. Her jeans were ripped, her thin sweater soaked through, clinging to her skin. Even in the dim light, Walter could see it, the bruises. Dark patches along her arms, a cut on her temple where dried blood had mixed with rainwater. He crouched beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her ice-cold wrist. A pulse, faint but steady. "Ma'am?" he called, giving her shoulder a gentle shake. Nothing. Rex hovered beside him, his body stiff, ears pricked forward, watching their surroundings like a sentry. Walter knew better than to ignore the dog's instincts. Something wasn't right. Glancing up and down the alley, Walter hoisted the woman into his arms. She was lighter than she should have been, like she hadn't eaten properly in days. Whoever she was, she'd been running from something, or someone. Back at his house, Walter laid her down on the couch beside Oliver, wrapping her in a dry blanket. She didn't wake up immediately. Her breathing was shallow, but the warmth of the room seemed to help. Rex refused to leave her side, his eyes constantly darting to the window as if expecting trouble to knock at the door. Walter sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. What had he gotten himself into? Then a soft sound, not from Oliver this time. The woman stirred. Walter turned just as her eyes fluttered open. At first, she looked dazed, confused, her gaze flickering around the unfamiliar room. Then her eyes landed on the small bundle beside her, and everything changed. A single guttural sob broke from her lips as she lunged for Oliver, clutching him to her chest as though afraid he might vanish into thin air. Walter took a step back, giving her space. "My baby," she whispered between ragged breaths, tears streaking down her face. "Oh my God, my baby." Oliver stirred in her arms but didn't wake. The woman buried her face in his tiny body, her shoulders shaking violently. Walter waited. He'd seen grief before, raw, unfiltered. He knew better than to interrupt it. After what felt like minutes, she finally looked up at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but sharp. "Where did you find him?" Walter pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "By the road, in a car. Backseat door was open. You left him there?" Her face crumpled. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered. Walter didn't respond, letting the silence push her forward. The woman, Lena, took a deep, unsteady breath. "I was running," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I had time. I thought—" She broke off, shaking her head. "I thought I could get him somewhere safe first. But he found me." Walter leaned forward. "Who?" For a second, she hesitated, but then anger flashed in her eyes. "Mark," she spat, like the name itself was poison in her mouth. "Mark Sutton." Walter's grip on his knee tightened. He knew that name. Everyone in town did. Mark Sutton was bad news. Ex-military, private security. A man with too much money and too many connections in the wrong places. He'd been suspected of plenty of things, violence, threats, smuggling, but nothing ever stuck. "He won't stop," Lena continued. "He won't stop until he has me, and Oliver." Her voice wavered. "I thought I could get away this time. I really thought—" Walter exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. He had no business getting involved in something like this. But he looked at Oliver, still sleeping peacefully, his tiny fingers curled against Lena's sweater. And then he looked at Rex, the dog who had been trained to find the lost, to bring people back from the edge of disaster. Rex hadn't let Walter ignore Oliver's cries in the storm. And now, he was watching Lena the same way, like he knew she was just as lost. Walter sighed. Maybe he didn't get a choice in this either. "You got anywhere to go?" he asked gruffly. Lena shook her head, her entire body tense. "Not if he's looking." Walter nodded once, pushing himself to his feet. "Then you stay here." Lena's eyes widened. "What?" "You stay here," he repeated. "For now." Lena opened her mouth, probably to argue, but Walter had already made up his mind, because no matter how much he wanted to keep his head down, to stay out of things that weren't his problem, Mark Sutton wasn't going to stop, and that meant neither was Walter. The storm had begun to ease, but the tension inside Walter's house was only growing thicker. Rain still pattered against the windows, a steady, rhythmic tapping that filled the silence between deep, uneasy breaths. The wind had lost some of its fury, but the occasional gust rattled the old wooden frame of the house, making it creak like an aging ship caught in rough waters. Walter sat at the small kitchen table, his fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Across from him, Lena sat with Oliver cradled against her chest, gently rocking the baby back and forth, her eyes distant, lost in a place far away from the dim glow of the kitchen light. Rex lay near the door, his body tense even in rest, his ears flicking toward every sound. The dog hadn't fully relaxed since they had brought Lena inside, his sharp instincts clearly sensing that whatever she had been running from hadn't been left behind. Walter wasn't the type to jump at shadows, but he trusted Rex's instincts more than his own. And he was right to. Because when Walter finally stood, stretching out the stiffness in his bad knee, he turned toward the window and saw it. A black SUV parked across the street, just barely visible under the flickering streetlight. He stopped breathing for a second, watching. No headlights, no movement. But someone was inside, watching, waiting. Walter felt something cold settle in his chest. Slowly, carefully, he reached over and flicked off the kitchen light, throwing the room into semi-darkness. Lena stiffened, her arms tightening around Oliver as she turned to follow his gaze. "What is it?" she whispered. Walter didn't answer right away. He moved toward the window, keeping to the side, staying in the shadows. His heartbeat was steady, but his gut churned with the kind of unease he hadn't felt in years. It was a feeling he knew all too well. Being watched, being hunted. His fingers twitched at his side, an old habit, back when he used to reach for his radio, his gear, his team. But those days were gone. He was on his own now, except he wasn't. Because at that exact moment, Rex let out a low, menacing growl. Walter's eyes snapped to the dog. Rex was rigid, his head slightly lowered, his ears pinned back. He was focused on the front door, his breathing slow, controlled, like a predator stalking something unseen. And then, a soft sound, the whisper of paper against wood. A small, folded note had just been slipped through the narrow crack beneath the door. Walter's stomach tightened. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the storm's distant murmur and the quiet rasp of Lena's breathing. Then Walter stepped forward and bent down, his fingers closing around the damp paper. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing it against his palm. There were only 5 words, scrawled in rough, jagged ink. "You can't run forever. Hand him over." A breath of silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Lena let out a choked gasp. Walter heard her shift in her chair, holding Oliver closer, as if the words alone were enough to make the baby disappear. Walter's grip on the note tightened until the paper crinkled. He turned, locking eyes with Lena. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. But behind the fear there was something else. Defiance. She wasn't going to give in, and neither was he. Walter took a slow, deliberate breath, then reached for his phone. 911. He hit dial. Nothing. The line clicked, then fell silent. No ringing, no operator, just dead air. Walter pulled the phone away from his ear, checked the screen. No service. His jaw clenched. The storm must have taken out the cell towers. Or maybe this was planned. Lena watched him carefully, her expression tightening as she realized what that meant. No police, she whispered. Walter exhaled sharply. Not tonight. Lena swallowed hard, but she nodded. For the first time since he had met her, she didn't look like she wanted to run. She looked like she wanted to fight. Walter could respect that. But if they were going to make it through this, they needed a plan. He moved quickly, pulling the curtains closed before flicking off the remaining lights in the house, plunging them into darkness. Lena held Oliver closer, rocking him gently as he stirred. Walter turned to Rex, who was already at the door, listening, waiting. They only had one choice. They weren't giving up the baby. They weren't letting Mark win. Walter had spent too many years haunted by the moments when he couldn't save someone. That wasn't happening tonight. Mark thought this was going to be easy. That was his first mistake. His second, thinking Walter Dawson didn't still know how to fight. The house was dark, silent. Walter stood near the front door, his grip firm on the old revolver he had pulled from a locked box in his closet. Rex stood beside him, muscles coiled, ears pricked forward, his breathing slow but deliberate. He was waiting, watching. Lena sat in the farthest corner of the room, cradling Oliver, her back pressed against the wall as if she could disappear into it. She barely breathed, rocking the baby gently, trying to keep him from stirring. Outside, the storm had finally begun to break. The rain had slowed, and the wind had softened, leaving only the eerie hush of a town that felt too still, too quiet. Walter had seen it before. The calm before the ambush. He exhaled slowly, scanning the shadows beyond the window. The black SUV was gone, but that didn't mean they had left. He knew better than to believe that, and he was right, because when Walter turned to check the front lock, the back door exploded open. A crash, a burst of wind, and then movement. Walter spun, but before he could react, Rex was already there. The dog moved like a missile, a blur of muscle and fury. Teeth flashed in the darkness, a deep, guttural snarl tearing through the air. The intruder barely had time to raise his weapon before Rex slammed into him, driving him to the floor with bone-crushing force. The man screamed, struggling against the sheer power of the dog, but Rex didn't let go. His jaws locked around the man's forearm, cutting off his ability to reach for his gun. Walter barely had time to process the attack when a second figure lunged at him from the hallway. A sharp crack of pain shot through Walter's ribs as he was tackled. The wind knocked from his lungs. He hit the ground hard, his revolver sliding across the floor, spinning out of reach. For a split second, the world blurred, his vision swimming. But he wasn't done yet. The weight on top of him shifted as the attacker moved to grab the gun, but Walter was faster. With a surge of strength, he drove his elbow back, hard, into the man's gut. The attacker grunted in pain, giving Walter just enough time to grab the edge of a nearby chair and swing it upward, catching the man in the jaw. He collapsed to the side, groaning. Walter scrambled for his gun. And then Mark Sutton stepped through the doorway. The room fell still. Walter stopped. Lena stopped. Even Rex froze, his teeth still buried in the other man's arm. Mark stood there, calm, composed, the stormlight casting deep shadows over his face, and in his hand, a gun aimed directly at Lena and Oliver. Walter's blood ran cold. "Let him go," Mark said, nodding toward Rex. The dog didn't move. I said, let him go. Walter swallowed, his mind racing. He could see Lena trembling, her arms tightening around Oliver, her body shielding him as best she could. Rex let out a low, menacing growl, but Walter knew they were out of time. Mark's finger tightened on the trigger. Walter felt something coil in his chest. This was it, the moment where everything could end. Mark pulled the trigger, and Rex launched himself forward. The dog moved faster than the gunshot. 1 second, Mark was in control. The next, he was fighting to keep his balance as nearly 90 pounds of muscle slammed into his chest. The shot fired, but it went wild, shattering a lamp instead of finding its target. The gun hit the floor, skidding toward Walter's feet. Walter didn't hesitate. With a practiced, steady grip, he raised his revolver and fired. The bullet tore through Mark's leg, sending him crumpling to the ground with a strangled yell. The room erupted into chaos. Rex stood over Mark, his teeth bared, growling so low it made the floor vibrate. The second intruder, his arm still mangled from Rex's earlier attack, scrambled back toward the door, his hands raised in surrender. And then, red and blue lights flooded through the windows. The sound of tires screeching, doors slamming, voices shouting. Walter let out a slow breath as police officers stormed the house, weapons drawn, quickly taking control of the scene. Everything felt distant, like he was watching it happen from underwater. Lena was still huddled in the corner, her face buried in Oliver's tiny frame. Mark was writhing on the floor, blood seeping through his pant leg, his face twisted in rage and pain. The second man was already being forced to the ground by 2 officers, his wrists yanked behind his back. And Rex stood tall, his chest heaving, his eyes still locked on Mark like he was daring him to move. Walter exhaled, finally lowering his gun. It was over. The nightmare was over. But as Walter turned, taking in the wreckage, the shattered lamp, the overturned chairs, the bullet hole in the wall, Lena still clutching Oliver like she would never let go. He knew one thing for certain. Rex wasn't just some dog the world had given up on. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't broken. He was a protector. And tonight, he had saved them all. The chaos had settled, but the weight of the night still lingered in the air. The flashing red and blue lights outside Walter's house had begun to fade as the last of the officers wrapped up their investigation. Inside, the wreckage remained. Shattered glass, overturned furniture, a bullet hole in the wall that would forever serve as a reminder of what had nearly happened. But in the center of it all, Lena held Oliver close, safe in her arms. Walter stood by the window, arms crossed as he watched the officers shove Mark into the back of a police cruiser. His face was contorted in pain, his leg wrapped in makeshift bandages from where Walter had shot him. Even through the tinted glass, Walter could see the rage still simmering in his eyes. But rage wouldn't help him now, because the evidence was overwhelming. Mark had thought himself untouchable, but when the officers had searched his car, they found more than just weapons. Stashed away in the trunk were documents, lists of names, locations, financial records, proof of the human trafficking ring he had been running for years. The officers who had once been hesitant to act against him now had no choice. He wasn't just a violent man with a grudge, he was a criminal, and now the entire town knew it. Lena exhaled, her grip on Oliver tightening. She hadn't spoken much since the gunfire had stopped, her mind likely still reeling from the near loss of everything she had fought so hard to protect. Walter turned back to her, his voice rough but steady. "He's done, Lena." She looked up at him, her lips trembling slightly. "Are you sure?" Walter nodded, glancing back at the cruiser as it pulled away from the curb. "He won't be walking free again." A long, shaky breath escaped her lips, as if years of fear had finally begun to lift from her shoulders. Then finally, she smiled. It was small, hesitant, but real. "Thank you," she whispered. Walter shrugged. "Wasn't just me." And he meant it. Because when he looked down, Rex was sitting beside him, his dark eyes still alert, scanning the room like he was waiting for the next threat to appear. Walter reached down, running his fingers through the thick fur along the dog's neck. Rex leaned into the touch, just slightly, before letting out a deep, exhausted sigh. The dog had saved them all tonight, and the town wouldn't forget it. Word of the night's events spread quickly. By morning, Rex's name was everywhere. The once-forgotten K9, labeled too dangerous to be adopted, had become a hero overnight. Walter wasn't one for attention, but he couldn't step outside without someone stopping him. Neighbors, store owners, even the local news station, wanting to hear the story of how Rex had taken down a criminal and saved a mother and her child. At the shelter, things had changed too. Rex was no longer just another problem dog waiting for time to run out. He had been given a second chance. Walter had been coming to the shelter for months, telling himself it was just to pass the time, to keep his hands busy. But now, as he filled out the adoption papers, he realized the truth. He hadn't saved Rex. Rex had saved him. The afternoon sun was warm, casting golden light across the town square. A small crowd had gathered outside the Shoreline Animal Rescue Center, watching as Walter stepped onto the porch, Rex by his side, a brand new tag hanging from his collar. There was a round of applause, a few cheers, and even a local news reporter asking questions. But Walter ignored it all, focusing only on the dog who now belonged to him. "Guess you're stuck with me now," he muttered, scratching behind Rex's ear. The dog huffed, his tail thumping lazily against the wooden floor. And for the first time in a long time, Walter felt like he had something to look forward to. A future, a family, and a damn good dog to walk beside him. A year had passed since the night of the storm, but for Walter Dawson, it felt like a lifetime ago. The quiet coastal town had returned to its slow, peaceful rhythm, but there was a new story woven into its history now. A story about a retired firefighter, a forgotten K9, and a night when everything changed. Walter had never cared much for attention, but he and Rex had become something of a local legend. People still stopped him on the street to ask about the dog, the hero who had saved a mother and child, the protector who had taken down a dangerous man. But for Walter, it was never about heroism, it was about finding purpose again. And so, when the idea first took root in his mind, he hadn't ignored it like he once would have. He had spent months thinking about what came next, about what to do with the time he had left. And then he knew. If Rex could be saved, if a dog once labeled dangerous could find his place again, then maybe others could too. That was how the Guardian K9 Training Center was born. The shelter had been struggling for years. Too many dogs, too little funding, too few people willing to take a chance on an animal with a past. But Walter saw something different. He saw potential. He saw what Rex had shown him, that no dog was beyond saving. The Guardian K9 Training Center wasn't just a place to house strays, it was a second chance. Walter had worked with other former handlers, training dogs that had been retired from service, search and rescue dogs, former police K9s, even military dogs that had nowhere to go once their work was done. He taught them new skills, matched them with new partners, veterans in need of companionship, families looking for protection, first responders who could use a highly trained partner by their side, and Rex was at his side for all of it. The once restless, discarded K9 had become a teacher, a leader for the other dogs who came through their doors. He trained with them, showed them the ropes, gave them something to follow, just like he had once done for Walter. It wasn't long before people from all over came to hear about the program. Donations started rolling in, volunteers signed up, and the shelter that had once been on the brink of shutting down had now transformed into a thriving sanctuary for the dogs that needed it most. And then, one day, Walter arrived at the training center to find something new standing in the front courtyard. A statue, bronze, life-sized, perfectly capturing the fierce, noble form of Rex as he had been on the night he saved them all, body poised, ears alert, eyes sharp and unyielding. At the base, a plaque read, "No dog is ever worthless, only waiting for the right person to be loyal to." Walter swallowed hard, running a weathered hand over the words. He never thought he'd see a monument for a dog, but if any dog deserved it, it was Rex. "Looks just like you," he muttered, glancing down. Rex sniffed the base of the statue, then sat beside it, looking up as if he understood. His tail thumped once, slow and steady, and for Walter, that was enough. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Walter found himself exactly where he wanted to be. The sky was painted in strokes of orange and pink, the fading light stretching long shadows across the beach as the waves rolled lazily against the shore. Beside him, Rex padded along the sand, his dark coat catching the last glimmers of sunlight. A few steps ahead, Lena walked with Oliver in her arms, the toddler giggling at the feel of the ocean breeze against his face. Walter had never imagined himself here. A year ago, he had been nothing more than an old man passing the time, waiting for his days to run out. Now, he had a family. Not one bound by blood, but by something stronger. By loyalty, by trust, by the knowledge that no matter how lost they had been, they had found their way home. And as Walter looked toward the horizon, watching the light fade into night, he knew the best was still to come. At its core, this heartwarming story is about second chances, not just for people, but for the forgotten, the overlooked, and the misunderstood. It's about the bond between a man and a dog, both of whom had been cast aside by the world, only to find new purpose in each other. There's something deeply moving about dog stories that go beyond simple companionship. Dogs aren't just pets. They are protectors, healers, and, in many ways, silent witnesses to the struggles of human life. Rex wasn't just a hero for a single night. He was a reminder that loyalty and love can thrive even in the darkest moments. His story isn't just about bravery. It's about resilience, about proving that no soul, human or canine, is ever truly lost if given the chance to belong. Walter's journey mirrors that of so many who have faced loss and felt their sense of purpose slip away. It speaks to the idea that even when we think we are done contributing to the world, life has a way of showing us that our greatest days may still be ahead. By giving Rex a home, he didn't just save the dog, he saved himself too. And then there's Lena and Oliver, a mother and child fighting for safety, finding it in the most unexpected place. It's a reminder that heroes don't always wear badges or capes. Sometimes, they are an old firefighter who refuses to give up, a mother who won't stop running, or a dog who knows exactly when to stand his ground. This isn't just a story about survival. It's a testament to the power of trust, the depth of loyalty, and the simple truth that love, whether from a human or a dog, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. In the end, it's about the families we choose, the bonds we build, and the way one act of kindness can change everything. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.